Hello everybody, my name is Andrew Trolson and I am going to be talking in this video chat about Expression-Blend. I gave this talk a little while back at the Twin Cities Microsoft offices, and I'm just kind of re-recording it this morning for those of you that weren't able to attend. Now, as you can see from this opening image here, there's a very clear distinction between what Blend could let people become. We are not going to become graphical artists by going through this discussion. What I really want to do here is to kind of illustrate some of the key parts of Expression-Blend that programmers will find immediately useful. When it comes to making things look ultra sexy, that's probably better served for a graphical artist. But we, as developers, can certainly take Blend out for a test drive and also use it to get some more complicated things done in a much easier way than we would if we were using Visual Studio alone. So here's the hit list that we're going to go through. I'm going to begin by just kind of making sure we're all on the same page when it comes to why we need Blend anyway. I think a lot of you already know that, but just in case. Then I'm going to go ahead and just talk about some basic building blocks of the tool. We'll talk about things like the asset library. I'll talk about the designer and its relationship to the objects and timeline window, which can be a little unintuitive. I'll talk about the really fancy properties editor and just kind of get our bearings on things like the tool strips. Well, once we get those basics out of the way, then things are going to get a little more interesting. I think a lot of you are aware that one of the really neat things about WPF and Silverlight controls is there's this wonderful parent class called content control. And anything which extends that parent class has the ability to reshape its internal display. So rather than thinking that every single button has to have a string, we could say, well, my button has a nested stack panel that displays images and text. This fact alone makes WPF and Silverlight really compelling as a technology because it greatly decreases the amount of custom controls we have to build by hand. Well, we are designing this complex inner content using just Visual Studio. That could actually involve quite a bit of XAML. And Blend has a really nice way to build up that same kind of internal content with a graphical designer. Then we'll be talking about a collection of related topics. We will be talking about 2D geometries, the really fancy brush editor, applying graphical transformations, and how to construct resources in Blend. And we'll see that, just as you would expect, there's a way to define application level resources, resource dictionaries, or resources that are embedded within some sort of a UI element. Then we will talk about the animation editor. Now remember, when we're doing WPF and Silverlight animations, it doesn't mean that we have to be building video games here, right? We can use animations for much more subtle effects, like a slight glow over a text box when it receives focus. Or maybe when the mouse goes over a custom control template, you want to have it throb a little bit. So there's lots of really subtle animations that we can do, and Blend has this fully integrated animation editor, which makes things pretty darn simple. Now, this one right here, I think, is extremely cool. Blend has this ability to magically transform a rendered geometry into a button style or a brand new custom user control. And this is totally sweet because with a simple click of a mouse button, you can have this beautiful image that a graphical artist put together for you become a full-featured user control. And this is just great. So I think you guys are going to really like that. And as soon as we start to make custom controls, we have to bump into the topics of templates and triggers. So we will also spend a little time talking about how to do that kind of stuff with Blend. And I'm going to wrap up with just a real quick peek at the forthcoming Blend 3.0, which really improves upon things that we have today. So let's just start at the very beginning. Let's make sure that we're all on the same page when it comes to why do we need this Blend thing anyway. Well, the truth of the matter is that Visual Studio has really lame support for doing complicated XAML. I mean, yeah, we get IntelliSense, which is nice, but when it comes to like the visual designer, that's pretty lacking. The WPF designer is okay. currently the Silverlight Designer is completely read-only. So if you were going to make a brand new Silverlight application and you were only going to use Visual Studio, that would mean you would have to be typing every single line of markup by hand. There's no drag and drop experience. You can't even select things on the properties window and actually change their properties. Thankfully, Visual Studio 2010 will rectify this, but today it's not the case. So there's an obvious need for Blend. You know, Visual Studio can only take you so far. So here in this little screenshot is a simple application that I whipped together for this demo. And the required markup is certainly not rocket science. But when you start to do things like make custom brushes, then all of a sudden you're bumping into typically hexadecimal values to fill up all your gradient stops. And that is extremely tedious to try to type that into Visual Studio, see how it looks, make a change. So when we use a tool like Blend, we're going to have this full brush editor that makes it really ridiculously simple to build things like custom, gradient brushes, for example. Also, as you already saw from that previous slide, Blend can just do some awesome things with the snap of a finger, like just create brand new controls on the fly. So even if you are not considering yourself a real graphical artiste, don't worry, Blend still has plenty of cool tricks for you. Okay, so essentially all Blend really is just a big, huge XAML generator. That's all it's doing. Don't think that Blend 2.0 is a code editor, because it's not. You'll be able to see your C# and VB code files in the Blend project area, but as soon as you try to double click on them, it's just going to launch Visual Studio. So this is a little different in Blend 3.0, but I'll talk about that towards the end of this discussion. Now, if you're not aware of this, the nice thing is that the project format of Blend 2.0 is identical to that of Visual Studio. So this is a really great collaboration, right? You could begin a brand new WPF or Silverlight project in Visual Studio. A programmer could kind of, put together a basic UI that gets the job done, write some event handlers, write some code, save it all out, and then a graphical artist could open the same exact project in Blend and then make things look a whole lot more interesting, more eye candy. Or conversely, you could begin a brand new project in Blend. The graphical artist could make things look really, really great straight away, and then we open that project in Visual Studio and start to add event handlers. Okay, so typically WPF and Silverlight applications, you're going to be using both products kind of side by side. Now, this little talk is meant, again, just to kind of showcase some of the key pieces of working with Blend. This is not going to be a comprehensive examination of every possible thing you can do with the tool. So this is where the help system is really important. But don't be looking for your help in MSDN documentation. Blend itself has a full help system, and of course, as always, F1 is our friend. So I really encourage you, if you're interested in digging in deeper, just fire up Blend and open up the help system. You're going to find oodles and oodles of tutorials. It'll show you all the keyboard shortcuts. It'll go ahead and show you a lot of things that I'm not going to talk about here. Like if you're doing WPF, there's a whole 3D graphics editor as well. So don't be bashful. Get in there and check it out. And the other thing too is if you go to the official Expression website, you're going to find oodles of other training videos, and it will go ahead and kind of add to and extend what I'm talking about here today. So let's go ahead and get ready to do our first little demo. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to flip over to Expression-Blend, make a little sample project, and just kind of kick things around a little bit. So let me just go ahead and flip over here. Okay, so here was that screenshot that you saw a couple of slides back, and I think for this one, maybe I'll just leave this open here. We'll just kind of take a look at what we get. Pretend for a second though that this is a blank slate. Okay, when you first fire up Blend, you're going to see a screen that looks like this, and this is where you can just kind of pick a brand new project or open an existing project. Let's just say, for example, you wanted to make a brand new project. So this is where you're going to see a couple of different options. And you're really, again, you're either going to be doing a WPF program or you're going to be doing a Silverlight program. So let's say you're going to make a executable for WPF. You just want to go here. Of course, we want to forget that this ever happened. All we care about is Silverlight 2. Based on whichever one you pick, notice how you can specify your language of choice. So I'll make a brand new one in a little bit, but for right now, we'll just take a look at this existing project. Okay. So first thing that we need to look at is over here on the left, we have this area which is just a palette of different widgets and tools, similar to what you might find in the Visual Studio toolbox. Okay. But notice how some of these options have a really tiny triangle on the lower right corner. That's kind of your cue that if you were to click and hold, you're going to see related options pop up here. Right? So for example, here are all your different panels. Well, not all, but here are some suggested panels. Here are some suggested text areas, suggested input items. Okay? Now, from this little simple area, you're not going to find every possible control put here by default. And that's what we have down here, this little guy called the Asset Library. As soon as you click on this, it's going to pop up a list of a whole bunch of other controls that you could add to this toolbox. You'll probably always want to click Show All. Why that's not done by default, I'm not sure. But this will give you a real good list of the core system controls from WPF or Silverlight if you pick a Silverlight application. There are also ways here to kind of play around with custom controls if you've incorporated those into your project. If you have some styles that you've already created in your application, you can find them here. Right? So we don't have to worry about any of those for right now. But just remember that this is where you can kind of select your item, and then once you've selected, for example, the ellipse, I could come over here and just start to draw on top of my editor. Right? Now I don't have to do that right now, so I'll just kind of get rid of that. Now the next thing I want to point out is over here on the right-hand side. Okay? Notice how, very similar to Visual Studio, Blend has this little project area. So I made a Silverlight application for this demo, so we can see that I have my page and my code file. I have my application derived class, and he has his code file. I can see that I have a bunch of assembly references that have already been set for me, right? So this part feels probably pretty similar to a Visual Studio application, but remember, Blend is not a code editor. So if I were to go behind this C# file and double click, you'll notice that Visual Studio launches, right? So all of a sudden now I'm kind of operating on two different tools for the same project here. So keep that part in mind. Now, right next to the project area, oh, and by the way, from this project area, you can do very similar things that you would in Visual Studio. So I could right-click on this project. I could add new items and existing items, like maybe a brand new user control. Notice how I can add assembly references, just like I might in Visual Studio. Okay? But I'm probably guessing most graphical artists aren't going to be over here too often. They're going to be more concerned about this area, okay, the properties editor. Based on what you select in your property editor, or I should say on your visual designer, the property editor is going to kind of change. Okay, so we see here that I selected a particular stack panel, and from this editor I could configure various aspects of this little stack panel, right? And I'll be kind of drilling through some of these as we go along, but you can see like I've already set up a color for that stack panel. So as I change it, you can see how that red on the designer changes quite a bit, right? There are areas over here for applying transformations, which I don't need now, but you know, I could tinker with this if I really wanted to. See how I'm skewing my panel right there? Okay. So this little properties editor is much more elaborate than we have in Visual Studio. Again, really kind of geared towards those with a graphical mindset. And the final part over here is the resources area. And this is just all of your different resources, right? So I actually have a couple that are already part of this project, and we'll talk about making resources by hand in just a couple seconds here. Right? So we'll see more of this as we go along. Now the next thing is, when you're on the Visual Designer, notice how we have a couple of different ways to view stuff. Right now I'm exclusively seeing the design mode, But I could also view all the XAML in the background, and I can also get kind of a split perspective view if I want to kind of see both areas. Now with Blend 2.0, I'd like to point out that we have no IntelliSense when we are working with the XAML editor. So let's say, for example, I'm down here inside of this image control, and I want to start typing in some more properties. You can see how I'm clicking the space, and it's not showing me any kind of IntelliSense at all. Even if I start to type, like let's say I want to, let's say I don't already have height. If I were to start typing in here, height, see I got nothing, right? So this again is not meant to be a direct XAML editor. You know, let the tool do it for you, right? If you really have to tweak things that are generated by the tool and you're using Blend 2.0, you're going to be better served opening this project in Visual Studio where I could get my IntelliSense back. So let me just go back to my design view here. Now the last little part that I want to show for this just first look is this guy over here called Objects and Timeline. This is probably one of the most annoying aspects of Blend 2.0, which thankfully has been fixed in Blend 3.0. Okay? If you look over here at my Objects and Timeline perspective, you're going to see how there is one particular thing that always has a yellow border around it. Right? So right here, there's my yellow border. Here's a different yellow border. The yellow border is key. And to activate a yellow border, you gotta double click. Okay, if you don't double click, if you just do a single select right here, it's gonna really change the operation. And this can make things quite unintuitive. Okay, so let me try to clarify this. So notice again how this nested stack panel has the yellow border right now. And on my designer, I can see, yep, sure enough, there's this big yellow border for that particular panel. The reason you want to pay attention to the yellow border is, if I were to double click to add a new button, whichever thing has the yellow border is the area that it's going to be inserted into. So you can see how I just have this new button that got wedged into my selected stack panel. Now this is what I was doing forever, and I was driving myself completely insane. You know, I would come over here and just like click on user control. So I'm thinking, yeah, well, that's not a good example. Let's say I selected my layout root, and I'm thinking, okay, I want to add in a brand new button. So I double click, right? And it went to the selected thing in the yellow. Even though over here I selected layout root, I thought, because this guy had the yellow border, it put it here. Okay? So if you really wanted to add something to that layout root, you got to double click it so we get the yellow border. And now when I do this, okay, now it actually added it to that particular last chunk of the layout root. So just one little thing that can probably drive you insane if you're not careful. Okay, so keep that in mind. Again, now when we get to Blend 3, they made this a lot more intuitive. But for right now, all hail the yellow border. Now, the other parts of Blend, like states, okay, Visual State Manager stuff would be here. If we're doing a WPF project, that would be a triggers editor. We'll talk about that later when we're building some custom controls. Okay, but that's kind of the quick survey that I wanted to give you all right now, just on the basics of the IDE. So let me flip back over to my slide deck. Okay, so just let's just go over this one more time real quick. Remember that the asset library, this guy right down here, okay, that's your chance to include additional widgets that are not currently on your toolbox. Remember over here, we got a couple of different ways we can view the project. Right? The property editor is pretty darn elaborate, and it's kind of divided into several categories. I didn't show this, but you can collapse any one of these that you don't care to look at. Okay? And then, of course, we have objects and timelines. Don't forget about your lovely yellow selection. Okay. A couple of other things about the basics. If you are using Blend to throw together a brand new application, so you didn't start with Visual Studio, you know, it's going to follow all the same rules as any WPF or Silverlight project. So you should always give your XAML items a name to generate a member variable in your G file, okay, that auto-generated G file. So the way that we can do that in Blend, we just come to the Properties editor, And right in the very, very top is going to be your little name area. So that would just add in the expected x colon name equal to your markup. And another thing too, this can be a little misleading to people. There is a lightning bolt symbol on the properties editor, and I'm sure a lot of you know that's kind of your cue to handle an event, right? Well, if we tried to handle an event with this little event editor, it looks like we're going to be able to do it. Let's go see it ourselves. So let's say that I'm over on this image, and I want to play around with an event right now. So I might say, yeah, let's see what happens when the image has a mouse enter. So if I were to type in an event handler here, mouse is in, if I were to hit enter, look what happens again. It just launched Visual Studio. Oh, this, by the way, is not something that you would see. I opened up this project in Blend 3 at one point, so it wants to convert my project. I'll just cancel out of that. So had that not popped up, I would find that Visual Studio, right, just added in that new handler for me. So don't think that this is going to be your one-stop shop. Right? This will just kind of configure your markup and launch Visual Studio to, put in that completed handler. And another thing about the basics too, I think you're aware that when you make a brand new WPF project or a Silverlight project, the layout root defaults to a grid. Okay? That's cool. In some cases you might want to begin there. But if you were to right click on any one of the layout managers, there's this way to dynamically transform what you want that container to be. Right? So if you would rather have the layout root be a stack panel, you can just go ahead and select it right here. And here's a little note in your slides too. Well, I guess you don't have the slides, but in the video, again reminding about the importance of that good old yellow border, right? This is your way to select a nested panel to add in sub-elements. And remember, if you do what I used to do, if you just do a simple one-click selection here, but this guy has the yellow highlight, it's going to be adding everything to the stack panel. And remember, to change who has that input focus, just make sure you do a double click. Another thing too is you're building a really complex visual design. Let me just flip back over here to Blend. This would not necessarily be a complex visual design, but as you're building up your application, you might want to just selectively hide or show chunks. So let's say that we're kind of done with this stack panel. If I just click this little eyeball icon, it'll just kind of get that out of view. Now it's still there in my markup, okay? It's just not on the designer. Notice if I were to delete a nested panel, it's going to collapse it on the designer too. So all of a sudden now I don't have that real estate taken up on the layout root. And we can also do similar things too. We can dummy proof it, lock something so I can't come in here and indirectly mess it up. Right? Okay, so hopefully at this point you have your bearings on some of the basics of just kind of working with the IDE. What I'd like to do next is talk about that idea of custom content. Okay? And I think for this one I'm going to actually make a brand new project, but here's the basic way that it works. Blend has the ability to zoom in very, very deeply into any selected item. And as soon as you do that, you're able to do something called a direct select and kind of drill into the content of whatever you're looking at. Okay? And then at that point, you're just going to fall back to drag and drop operations. So let's go back to Blend. Let's go ahead and close this guy down. No need to save anything. And we'll start from scratch. So I'm going to go under File, New Project. I'll do a WPF application. And I'll call it Simple Blend App. And I'll click OK. So we'll pick C#. I can target my framework. We'll leave it at 3.5. This is how things will look upon setup. So again, notice over here in your project area, Blend was kind enough to put together a complete project, right? Presentation core, presentation framework, Windows base. Got my initial window put together here, my initial application. So now I'm going to come over here to the left, over to Objects and Timeline, and I will add, let's see, why don't I do this here? Why don't I change this to be a stack panel? And we already have the yellow selection here, so I'm just going to plop on a button. Now I might come over here to my Properties Editor, get out of my Event area, and let's give him a fixed height and width. We'll make him maybe 100 wide, and we'll make him 100 high, just so I have something to play with. So here, under Common Properties, you can see that there is an option for content. But this is just going to be a string. Okay? There is not too much that I can do here to put together a nested stack panel, for example. So that's where I have to come over here and get a little creative. Okay, so let's double click on the button. Notice how he has the yellow selection now. And I'm going to zoom in. Okay, I'm just doing a control mouse wheel right now. You can also come down here. There's a little zoom area on the lower left of your editor. And you're just going to zoom all the way in here until you get to a point where you feel that you can kind of see what you're trying to do. So I'm going to come over to my tool area. I'm going to pick this direct selection. Okay, this is a way for you to drill into selected content. So I just double clicked on top of my string. So that was just the system.string, right? I'm going to delete that. And instead, I want to add in here a panel, right? So I could come to my panel areas. Maybe I'll add in a stack panel. So you see now what happened? Okay, the button had the input focus. I did a direct select, and now my button contains as direct contact a stack panel. So I'll double click on him, and then maybe I'll just throw in I don't know, I'll just make some goofy example. We'll throw in a circle. Let's make this guy a little bigger so we can actually see it. All right. And then I'm also going to add in a text block. So we'll go ahead and select him, and we'll just go ahead and maybe we should give these guys a name too while I'm at it. So this will kind of demonstrate the importance of that name, right? So we'll go ahead and call this button circle, and I could call this little text block button text. And maybe for his text, I'll just say, click me. Right? So just a simple example here. Now, if we were to come back and let's go ahead and zoom back to a normal size. So there's my button with some complex inner content. If I flip back to my markup, as you would expect, the button now contains a stack panel. And that stack panel has my ellipse and my text block. Right? So just one little way that Blend can make our lives a wee bit easier by letting us kind of drill into that, selected control to really kind of tweak that internal nested content. And this was just a simple example. You could obviously get a lot more elaborate than I did. Okay. So remember the key. We want to go ahead and make sure we've double-clicked on what we need to edit, and then we can just start to zoom on in and either drag and drop or just double click things from our toolbox. Okay, so let's get on to this more exotic topic, right? If you've come to WPF or Silverlight from other graphical toolkits like MFC or maybe ATL, Windows Forms, VB6, all these different graphical toolkits, they all have their own spin on rendering services. And when you're working with these toolkits, it wasn't necessarily something you did all the time. A lot of times in these toolkits, you didn't need to get a device context or a graphics object unless you were literally doing something like maybe painting a pie chart based on a database read. Well, in the world of WPF and Silverlight, the ability to render graphics is way more common than it ever was. And the reason is because these are really graphical intensive APIs. They're really meant to build the eye candy. Okay? So Blend has a particular part of the editor which allows you to get access to all of the different shape types. And I think you know that the shapes are just one category of graphical rendering agents. The thing which is really great about the shapes is that they extend a couple of common parent classes which give you a ton of functionality. So if you were to use the rectangle, okay, this little rectangle class, it isn't just simply maintaining a top left, bottom right with a background color. This guy has pretty much as much functionality as any other widget, like a button. So in the world of WPF and Silverlight, if you want to go ahead and capture when a mouse is inside of your geometry, all you got to do is handle the mouse enter event. You don't have to calculate any kind of coordinates. You don't have to do any kind of hard coding to figure out where is the mouse cursor. Is it inside of the area that I've defined? This just happens for free. So things like hit testing, drag and drop functionality, that's kind of a cakewalk under WPF and Silverlight. And other things too, if you wanted to have a right-click menu system, or you wanted to have maybe a tooltip over a geometry, that's also painfully simple. You just simply pretend you're working with a button. So when we're using Blend to work with these shapes, you got to remember that these guys typically are the starting point for custom controls. So I'm not saying that you're going to have to use these areas to just paint some oddball shape and be done with it. Okay? As you're going to see in just a little bit, these oddball shapes can become much more interesting things. So let's go back over to Blend. And I'm going to actually get rid of this button. We're done with him. Okay, so we're back to an empty layout root. So let's go take a look at this area, right? The drawing types that correspond to the system.windows.shapes types, they're going to be divided into two areas in your toolbox. Okay, here we really have a direct mapping to the rectangle, ellipse, and line classes. But here we have these things called pens and brushes. These are both used to build path objects. All right? And by default, what Blend is going to do is it's going to use that little micro modeling language. So let's imagine that we wanted to use the pencil. Okay, if we were to use the pencil, this is for doing totally freehand drawing. So if I were to just build some odd shape here, right? If I flip back over to my markup, I'm going to see that I have a path. And the data property has been configured with this little micro language. Now, nobody in their right mind is ever going to expect any of us to manually type this kind of garbage in by hand. And if someone's asking you to do that, you might want to educate that person. Because this is something which is tool generated, right? You may not know this, but this little micro language is really, believe it or not, a shorthand notation for a much, much more robust object model using these things called geometries. Okay? So if you were to use the tool Expression Design, that tool typically renders out your paths using those geometries. So you might find quite a bit more markup there. Okay, here, even though this string can appear to be pretty darn gnarly, this is actually shorter than what we would have if we use the corresponding object model. Okay, whoop, a little too many undos there. Still too many. Let me go back here. Sorry about that. I just totally wiped off my guy. We'll delete him again. And then we'll put back up my geometry. Okay, so we'll go back to the pen, the pencil. And we got our guy in here. Right? Now, the pen is a little bit different. This allows you to make a series of connection points. And then for each one, I can start to kind of flip it out here. The reason it keeps snapping here, in case you're wondering, is I still have the stack panel as my default layout manager. Right? So this allows us to get a little more exotic in the shapes that we're trying to build. The remaining three here are real straightforward. Right? You just kind of get whatever you get. Now, that alone is okay, but I want to show you some more interesting things that we can do. So let me actually get rid of both of these. Just so we don't keep snapping things back, why don't we put this guy to a more appropriate canvas. So imagine that we are over here, and we're going to draw a little rectangle. Maybe we're going to put an ellipse over here. Okay? And maybe we have some intersecting areas. Well, using Blend, I'll go ahead and get the selection. Right? I can select multiple geometries, and as soon as I do that, I'm going to have access to a whole bunch of different operations to make new geometries, specifically to make new path objects. So here I could do like a intersection of these two things. So if I were to select that option, I would just see this little part pop in. Right? That's the intersection. If I were to do another operation to maybe do a combine and do a unite, right? Well, now we can see it kind of did the inverse. It found the intersection area, carved it out, and connected the endpoints. So using these particular options, we can just kind of reshape things to new paths. So just to make sure we get that, right now I really have a rectangle and an ellipse. So in my markup I see these two simple definitions. But if I were to do a combine, and maybe we'll do a divide. Now we come back over here, and we now have a path. Right? So it kind of did a transformation on those selected items to kind of reshape it into a path. And again, it uses that little data modeling language, the geometries. Now the other thing about working with these shapes, we can kind of get to know the brush editor a little bit now. So why don't we actually take a peek at that, right? So over here on your properties editor, the brushes area is actually a lot more interesting than you might think. If you want to just pick a solid colored brush, then this default is going to be great for you. Okay, it's going to default to a solid colored brush. And just using this little area, right, I can just go ahead and kind of change what color I want. Maybe I want to get some shade of blue. Right? And notice how it's basically changing the ARGB values. I could get in here myself and type in a value manually. Maybe I'll come over here and get this guy a different color. Okay. So again, we're just working with this idea of a solid colored brush. And the markup will just simply record the hex value for the fill property. Now the reason it set the fill property and not, for example, the stroke property, based on whatever you select in your designer, the brushes editor will show you all the things that require brushes. So if I really wanted to change the stroke property, just go ahead and click it up here. And let's see, why don't we just give him maybe a red stroke. Right? Maybe I'll change that stroke thickness to 10 so we can see it a little bit easier. But we're still operating in the world of solid colored brushes. So let's say you wanted to do a more exotic brush, right? You wanted to go ahead and do some kind of a gradient brush. Well, here are a couple of tricks that you can do with Blend. Step number one, and let's go ahead and maybe select this guy. Let's make a radial gradient brush over this circle. You're going to come over here and pick your gradient brush tab. And now you got a choice to make. Do you want to do a linear gradient, or do you want to do a radial gradient? Right? So I'll pick on this guy. Now, as soon as you do that, right, and you start to, I want to get to the fill property here. As soon as you do that, okay, you'll see that Blend will give you two gradient stops by default. So focus over here on these little thumbs. Right? Basically the starting and ending colors. So I picked the radial gradient. I click on this thumb and we can see that the starting color is going to be black. And if we look over on our designer, that's representing this area right here. The ending color is white, and that just kind of fades out over time, right, to get to this outer part. Well, these little thumbs can be dragged around. So if I want the the black area to take up a larger part of the real estate just by dragging the thumb, you can see what's happening there in my designer. I could also change this over here too. So if you don't want it to be a fade from black into white, you just have to click the thumb you want to change, and then we're back over here to the color editor, right? So maybe we'll start with maybe kind of a darker blue. And I want to end with maybe a bit of a lighter blue, something like that. And, maybe I'll kind of change that a teeny bit. Okay. So as I'm working with this part of the editor, if I flip back over to my markup, we're going to see now, and actually this happened just because I accidentally had the stroke property selected. So I could actually kill this. We could just go manually back up here. I would just say a stroke of black. Okay. But the interesting part took place down here. So notice how each one of my gradient stops has been given a hexadecimal value for the color. The offset was tweaked based on my dragging of the thumbs. And because I clicked on that radial gradient button, it gave me the radial gradient brush. Well, what if you want to have more gradient stops? All you got to do is click right on top of this little editor. So maybe I want to have a really dark brush to begin with. Maybe this guy is going to be a tad more blue, right? Or we could even, make this guy green for all I care, right? Something like that. Okay, so now as I'm playing around with these particular parts of the editor, that just basically added in this brand new gradient stop. Okay. Now notice by default, the origin of the gradient is in the dead center, right? Well, maybe you want that to start on an offset. So here's a little shortcut key for you. On the designer, when you have the item selected, just press the G key. Now notice I didn't say Control G. Okay, definitely don't think you're in Visual Studio. Most of the keyboard shortcuts are simply one letter. V, X, G. Well, as soon as you pick the G key, you're going to notice that we get this other part of the editor. Okay, see how I can kind of spin this around to change where that gradient stop's going to start? Okay, so I can spin it over here. Maybe come back over here and let's maybe make him a little bigger and more pronounced. So as I'm working with this here, right, keep playing with it, that's just going to basically be controlling my gradient origin. So what I want to point out here isn't so much what a beautiful circle I've made, and that's a joke obviously, but this kind of markup here would be just so tedious to type in Visual Studio. Especially when you think about you're working with things like gradient stops and trying to control hex values for things. That's no fun. So when we work with this integrated brush editor, we just get a much easier visual experience. Okay. So let me just flip back here to my slide deck and kind of catch us up. So remember what we're kind of looking at here, right? Blend has a fairly one-to-one correspondence for all the members of this toolkit. Right, so we've already talked about what the shapes bring to the table. When you're working with pens and pencils, that's pretty much how you work with polygons and polylines. But remember that internally, they're going to be represented as paths. I pointed out some things you can do here with the combined area. We talked about working with the brush editor, right? So here's a slightly more interesting brush, not as ghastly ugly as the one I put together. And again, working with Blend, all of this kind of stuff is going to be done through the brush editor. So I've already kind of walked through this with you, just by way of a quick reminder. Based on what you select on your designer, you're going to find a series of properties up here that are all brush aware, right? So all those things could receive as input some kind of a brush object. So pick your poison. Remember, this area is where you kind of pick the type of brush you want to work with. Probably most commonly you're going to be sticking to these two. You either want to have a solid brush or a gradient brush, but this guy can also be helpful. That basically means no brush. Blend has a habit of using the previously created brush to fill new geometries. So you might be surprised when you draw a brand new shape and it suddenly takes on the same brush that you just built on the other guy. Well, you can just click that button right there to kind of get it back to square one. This guy's obvious. Just go ahead and pick your color. This part here is maybe not so obvious. One thing which well, I should say maybe another thing which drove me batty as I was getting my bearings with Blend is I was down here inside of my little gradient stop editor, right? And I'm adding a whole bunch of things, kind of playing around. And suddenly I'm like, oh man, I've added way too many gradient stops. How do I get rid of these things? Well, being a Visual Studio kind of guy, I was doing what you would probably do. I was right-clicking on these darn gradient stop thumbs all day. I was trying to hit the delete key. I was doing everything, right? Nothing was working. Well, then I finally figured out all you got to do is just drag it off. Just click and drag it anywhere off that sliding area. And that will delete the thumb. Right? To me, not obvious, but I never claimed to be a bright man. So definitely just remember that. It'll hopefully save you some frustration. And then remember the G key, right? That will give you a way to change your gradient origin. And that can be done very simply just by typically clicking right over here and just moving that guy around with the mouse. Now, the next thing I want to talk about real quickly before we get to this idea of creating custom controls on the fly is Blend also has an editor, which I briefly showed you when I was changing around the skew of my stack panel, which allows you to work with transformations. So you can actually do this in two different ways. There's actually a transform editor in your properties window, but pretty much all these things can be done directly on the designer surface. So let me go ahead and flip back yet again. So why don't we pick on this guy for a while? So I'm going to go ahead and play around here with my square, right? Let's make him a slightly different size. And I think we're done with this guy. So let's go back to the square. Alright, so if you want to, you can actually come over here to your transform editor, and all the core transforms are listed here. Translate, rotate, scale, skew, right? So if you wanted to get really, really precise, you could come into maybe rotate, and I could just start to play around with some angles here. I can also just kind of come and move this slider around. You can see on my designer, it's kind of flipping this guy back and forth. As I'm doing this, Blend is just maintaining a transform group. One thing which is a little weird is Blend gets a bit aggressive when it tries to define your transform. So as soon as you're over there in that editor, even if all you're doing is tinkering with the skew, it's also going to be throwing in some, well, I guess I was doing the rotate, wasn't I? Even if all you're doing is playing around with the rotate, it's going to also throw in other transform objects for you, even if they're not used. You know, you got bigger fish to fry in your life than a couple of basic objects, you know. But I suppose if you really wanted to be prim and proper, you could delete those out if you don't want them there. But it's probably not going to have any real bearing on what you're doing. So if you don't want to come over here, remember that the editor itself can be used for almost all these operations. So if you wanted to just rotate the rectangle here, notice when I go to a corner, my mouse changes. That's how I'm doing my rotate. If you wanted to slant it, you know, skew it, come to a side. And you just got to put your mouse cursor right next to the grab area. See how it changed? Now I can kind of skew it out in different ways. Right? And I can also come over here and kind of play around with like points of origin. Right? There's my scaling. So pick your poison. Either way you go, what you're ultimately doing is you're configuring a transform group on the selected item. And then one other thing I want to point out before we get to some other topics, Blend has these two different selection pointers. And I know for me, it was really confusing. I, for the life of me, could not figure out what in the heck a direct select versus a select really meant. I mean, I'm going to select it, right? So what's the difference? Well, I've already shown you one example when we were talking about complex content. Remember that we zoomed in on that button really deep? and I did a direct select so I could get into that button and get to the content area. Well, from a real general purpose, okay, if you are doing a select, just a basic old select with this guy right here, that allows you to just click on the designer and, pardon the redundancy, but just select the thing itself with all of its little sub pieces, right? So if I had a button that had a nested stack panel and I do a select, I'm really just selecting the button. If I do a direct select using this guy down here, well, now I could drill into the things in the button. This is also really helpful when you're working with geometries. So check this out. Let's go ahead and blow him away. Imagine that we are working with the pencil, and I've made some kind of a path, right? So, see how I just grabbed my last brush, by the way? I warned you guys about that. So if I don't like that, I could just hit no brush, but that's fine. We'll leave them as an orange thing. So right now, again, if I were to do a basic selection, that just kind of allows me to reposition this thing in the canvas, right? And that's going to be helpful when you want to do things like scale it or rotate it. But what if I needed to come and fine-tune how this path actually looks, right? Maybe I want this part of my shape to kind of dip in this way. Well, that would be a job for a direct select. You see how I just activated the sub parts of the path, right? So now I can start to kind of play around with how this guy is going to look. So I'm actually operating on the interior of the shape, right? Not the shape itself. So now if I actually want to grab him to relocate it in the window, I got to come back to just a basic select. So because you're going to probably be toggling between these all day long, there's a couple of handy keyboard shortcuts, A and V. And remember now, we're not doing control anything. You just click the letter A, click the letter V. Now, I think this one's kind of unfortunate because I keep thinking about copy and pasting, but, you know, what do I know? Okay, so the last part here before we get to making custom controls is about working with resources. WPF and Silverlight both support this idea of object resources. Really, really common. Essentially what an object resource is a way for you to define a blob of markup, give it a name, and refer to it all over the place. And when you want to use that object resource and you want to refer to it in other areas, we use markup extensions. Typically static resource will get you there, but you could also use dynamic resource if you want to. So let's take a peek at how we can do that inside of a Blend project. Well, one example might be, let's say that we have this brush. Let me just kind of make this guy slightly more interesting. So I got this brush for my fill background. It's doing something. I'm thinking, geez, that is a pretty sweet brush. I want to use that same brush in multiple places. Well, the last thing you want to do is copy and paste that markup, because now if you want the brush to look like this, you got to change it in 20 different places. So on the brush editor, we have a really simple way to convert a brush into a resource. Plus brush. See that button right there? If I click it, Blend now says, okay, great. Where do you want me to put this thing? And what do you want me to call it? So I will call it my way cool brush. That's just going to define your key. Now here's where I can pick which scope I want it to be at. I could put it directly in the window, right? So if I pick the window, that would mean anything within this window has access to this brush. If I wanted to, I could embed it in the path, which is not going to be terribly helpful here. But it could be helpful if you wanted to maybe embed a resource in a stack panel that contained other layout managers, right? Then everything in that master stack panel would get that brush. But probably more common, you might want to put it in the application. And that will just update your app-derived class, right? Your application-derived class to have a resource container. And that way, every window in your project could get at it. And if you want to get even a little more modular, you could make a brand new resource dictionary. and that would just be an external XAML file. So I can say, for example, all my brushes.xaml, and that will add it into your project. Now, the great thing about doing this with Blend is it will automatically merge the resource dictionary. So let's check out what just happened, okay? First of all, if I were to go back and look at the markup for my path, okay, notice that when I put this guy together, right, my fill, which should be way down here, he's now using my resource by name. So he's no longer having the hard-coded gradient brush. It's referring to my way cool brush resource. And where did that end up? Well, we put it inside of a brand new XAML file, right? So this was just added to my project. If I double click to open it in Blend, it's just basically saying you can't design with this, but I can see the markup, right? So there's my resource dictionary. There's my way cool brush. And if I were to look in my application XAML, it merged my dictionary for me, which is great, right? So now all the things inside of my application can make use of the brush, which is actually defined inside of an external file. One other cool thing too, though, let's say that I'm back on my window, and I'm like, okay, I'm using this brush, but you know what? I actually wish I could change it a little bit. Well, as we just saw, when you're inside of a resource dictionary, there is no designer experience for that. So you might think to yourself, oh, crud. Does that mean I have to come over here and manually type out this markup? Well, actually, no. Look at what you can do. Okay, when you're here in the brush editor, so here's the fill, notice how it's going to show you all your resources in your project right here when I'm over at the brush resource tab. So if you want to change this little guy here, there's a pop-up editor, right? So now as I'm playing around with this, that's actually updating the markup back in this guy, my external XAML file. So that's kind of handy, right? So don't think that once you put it into a resource, that's it. You can still change it. Just remember that you have to come over here to the brush resources area, and then all your custom ones are going to be right here. All right? So at this point in our little chat, we've looked at a couple of nice things. We talked about working with just the basics of the Blend IDE. We talked about working with complex content, took a tour of working with some 2D geometries and transformations and brushes, and we just finished up here by talking about some resources. This whole part of the topic, or part of the video show here, kind of getting us to the point now where we can kind of take it to the next level. And we can now use Blend to actually create brand new controls on the fly. Before we get to that part, though, just want to throw out a little teaser in case you don't know this already. And this is public knowledge here, so no NDA is being broken. Silverlight 3.0, when it releases, it will finally support resource dictionaries, something that we didn't have in 2.0. So if you were to use Blend 3, you would also get the option to build a brand new resource dictionary, which is something that Silverlight programmers have wanted for quite some time. Now, as I mentioned, when we're working with WPF and Silverlight, animations are a lot more subtle than what you might be envisioning. And when you're going to build custom controls, animations are key. Reason is, every single control has something which is called the default template, right? And this defines within itself the default way that a control is going to look and feel, and the default visual cues that are going to be used to kind of let the user know what's going on, right? When the user clicks on a button, they assume that the button's going to look indented. If something has input focus, they're going to expect that it has some change of the border, for example. Well, if you make a brand new template, all those default visual cues are ripped out of there. So you could create a button that does nothing visually when you actually click on it. Right? You're still going to get the click event firing, but there's no visual cue. So whenever you're going to make a custom control, you got to add those back. And the way that we typically account for those visual cues is by using animations. Okay? So we need to look now at this animation editor of Blend. And in the first example, I will kind of do more of a traditional animation where I'm going to have like a moving object on the screen. But just remember, you're going to do the same exact thing when you are trying to incorporate visual cues. So let me go back to good old Blend here. Why don't we go ahead and move this shape around? Okay, we've just built something here. We need to now activate the animation editor. So here's the way it's going to work. Right? I'm going to go ahead and select my window. And over here in the Objects and Timeline area, there's a little teeny plus button that says New. This allows you to make something called a storyboard. A storyboard is sort of a XAML-friendly way of calling begin animation through markup. Because remember, XAML is not friendly to function calls. Right? XAML is all about properties and event handlers. So I'm going to give this guy a name, Move Odd Shape. Now as soon as I did that, the Objects and Timeline area kind of transformed, right? And I see this new part of the editing experience. Well, whenever you're trying to do an animation, here's another good key shortcut for you. Hit the F6 key. And that's going to go ahead and put this timeline editor along the bottom of your window, because what you're essentially doing when you're trying to build an animation is you have to go through a series of keyframes over a period of time, right? And with each unit of time, you have to kind of put in some effect. So it's going to be a lot easier to see that when we have this position here. If you hit the F6 key again, it'll just go back to the side. So you can just keep toggling back and forth here. All right, so let's pick our path. So he's the guy that I want to actually start to animate, right? So what we're going to need to do is insert these keyframes. So I'm going to capture this keyframe at starting point 0, right? So the very first unit of time. And then I'm just going to drag this over to maybe the 1 second mark. I'm going to add in another keyframe. So now you can see that Blend captured the fact that, okay, you're going to do something between this second of time. What are you going to do? Well, now I can just tweak any of the properties I want. So if I want to actually reposition this guy, I could just drag him over here. Then I might say, okay, now let's go over here to the 2 second mark. Add another keyframe. And now maybe we'll move him down here. And then we'll finish it up by doing like a really slow fade over here. Right? So I've just inserted these different keyframes. Each one can be edited uniquely. So as soon as I click on one of these little keyframe holders, check out on the right hand side of the Blend IDE, I have this little easing area where I could kind of add in some effects to make it kind of arc up or slowly fade down. Okay. Now once you kind of get each keyframe just the way you want it, you can see how things would look if you click on the play button. Right, so we can see that my little shape has moved along my little path. Okay. Now, when you're recording your keyframes, it doesn't have to only be for actual movement. Like maybe you might say, well, after I've moved to this location, I want to go over here, and over the period of 1 second, maybe I want to change the actual color of the. Let's see. Let's go here. I want to change the color of my path. Like maybe change the stroke, make it go from red to green. Right? So I just selected the stroke property. I just changed the color. Now watch what happens here. So we're all still red. Now it's going to fade into green over time. Right? So don't think that it has to literally just be about moving something on the surface. You could have an animation that would change any property. Right? So if I wanted to, again, maybe add in another keyframe here. And maybe I want to transform this guy. Let's see. Maybe I'll do a rotation. So at that point, I just want to kind of spin him around. So again, we'll see this animation taking place. Here's where we're going to change the color, and now we can spin around. So using this little animation editor, what I've basically done is I have written a whole bunch of markup. So if we were to take a peek here, we can see that a tool like Blend is actually now really helpful because it created this whole entire storyboard for me. And if any of you folks have tried to work with animations manually in Visual Studio, you're probably really happy because some of the syntax that we have to do in markup is pretty brutal, right? To actually get all these different things set together with their target properties. And a tool like Blend will just get that all done for us. Right, so here's just kind of again the basic setup. Remember, your ultimate goal is you are adding keyframes to your storyboard. And when we want to add keyframes, we just have this little add a keyframe button here. Remember that nice little F6 key that'll toggle the position of your editor vertically or horizontally. And then remember too, any property over here is a candidate to be animated. So if you want to change the transparency, you can just find that right here under the Appearance tab, and you can maybe have your control slowly fade from view over the period of 4 seconds. Oh, one other thing I'll point out too. Let's say that you've created this little storyboard. If you come back to Objects and Timelines, so here's my storyboard right here, right? Now, if you select it and you go look at your Properties area, under Common Properties is where you could do things like set up the auto reverse and repeat behaviors. So here I just set it to auto reverse, so now I would see something like this happen. So now it's just going to go backwards, right, and bring us back to where we started. Now, if I were to actually run this, let me show you one other little interesting thing. So I'm just going to hit the F5 key to actually launch the window. You might wonder to yourself, geez, now how did that happen, right? I just started the program and Blend is already animating stuff. Well, the reason is that by default, when you are building up this little animation directly on your window, the storyboard that you're creating is going to automatically execute when your window is loaded into memory. And that is controlled over here with the Triggers area. Now, I'm going to talk more about the Triggers area when we get to that custom control section, but let me just point it out now briefly. Okay? So, the Triggers area, well, let me just take a step backwards. In the world of WPF, a trigger is a way for you to capture when a certain event condition is true or false. And then when it's true, you typically will take a course of action. In many cases, that will be starting a storyboard. Now, if you're doing Silverlight, Silverlight has really limited support for triggers. Basically, all they have is a loaded trigger. But they have very similar functionality through something called the Visual State Manager. So if you're doing this demo using Silverlight, this is going to be a little different for you. But the same end result will still be there. So notice what I can do. Okay, by default, Blend is going to be capturing the window loaded trigger. So I'm just going to make sure I have him selected. And then notice what I can do down here. I can say, okay, well, what do I want to happen? Well, when the window is loaded, that's what we see up here, this is where I can pick my storyboard. So here's the storyboard that we just made. I could also make a new one here. And what do I want to do when it happens? Well, I want it to begin. Okay? Well, imagine that we don't want that to happen. So I'm just going to actually delete that completely. I want to add a whole different one. So I'm going to say when the window, and notice how I can pick from all these different triggers here. So I might say the mouse has to go down on my window. So when that happens, then I'm going to go ahead here. I'm just going to grab my storyboard. Actually, I can make a new one here if I want to. I can begin that one, right? So what I'm basically able to do now is I'm able to selectively figure out some kind of a condition. So if I did want to begin this new storyboard, right, I could just come over here to my editor and just repeat the same thing that we just did. So I might move this guy around, maybe pick this path. I can start to add in my little keyframes, move this guy around. So now, if I were to run this guy, and I click down on my mouse, now it's going to animate. Okay? So the triggers area is a pretty neat aspect of working with Blend, and it's a pretty neat idea in WPF in general. Basically, you can kind of handle events without really handling an event. You're just responding to some condition being true or false. And now for the crescendo, if you will. So we've looked at a bunch of little individual pieces. Now we can look at how to compose controls on the fly. And this is great because, again, this really brings together graphical artists and programmers into a shared space. So, again, you are a graphical artist, or pretend you are. And you've built this fairly interesting shape, and now you're saying to yourself, this would be great if only he was maybe a custom user control, or maybe a stylized button. Well, right now, we're nothing of the sort, right? We are a path. So look at what I can do through Blend, okay? If I were to right-click on this geometry, I get a couple of really interesting options, one of which is called Make Control. So if I were to select this, watch what will happen here. I get a chance to define the name, so I'm going to call it the Odd Shape Control. And when I click OK, Blend automatically made for me a brand new user control, right? And it added it into my project. And I have my corresponding C# file. So I could see here, I'm a user control. And notice how it put together the whole kit and caboodle here, right? It automatically realized that, well, you're going to have this storyboard as a resource. So when the mouse goes down, I can do something maybe, right? I find that the the path that I originally put together has been added here inside of my grid. And even better, if I were to take a peek at the original window that was making use of this, right? Let me get back to here. So here's my guy. Come to my window, right? We can see that it added a declaration for that control, and it was even kind enough to add a custom CLR tag prefix, right? So I can refer to that guy in markup even though he's defined actually in an external part of my application. So this is all good stuff, right? That was a pretty quick operation to get an entire custom control put together. And then if I want to, I could come back to my custom control and I can fall right back to my triggers. So I could say, okay, when the control loads, start a certain storyboard, right? I could capture things like, well, maybe I want to do something special like when the control has focus, right? Or when it's been double-clicked. Well, I can just go ahead and handle these different storyboards, right? And then by doing so, I can totally reincorporate all those visual cues. So I could just maybe add one more here. I could say when the maybe when the mouse is first entering into my control, I'm going to make a new storyboard. I'll just leave it here at the default name. And maybe what I'll do is when the mouse is inside, maybe I'm just going to go ahead and scale him by some factor. We can maybe shrink it down. Right? So now let's go ahead and see what we got here. So I'm going to go into my shape now and see how it just got smaller. If I were to add in another effect, such as when the mouse exits, well, then I could go ahead and make it expand back to that original size. So we're getting some pretty great functionality here all through this tool, right? So basically, Blend went ahead and recorded that storyboard and then connected it to the mouse entering routed event. Now there's a similar operation you can do as well. I just walked through this idea here about making a new control. Sometimes you don't want to get a brand new control, you just want to get a stylization. So look at what I can do here. Let's go back to my main window. And let's do this. Let's put on a new shape. Alright, so here's a rectangle. And I'll just change the fill properties. We can kind of see something here. So imagine that we like this guy. We want him to become a button, right? Well, this is even a better example. Let me show you this here. Let's look at something a little more exotic. I got some odd geometry. I want this guy to become a button. Well, what I can do is I can go ahead and just right-click on him, or I should say select him, come to my Tools area, right? Let me select my actual path. Come to my Tools area, and now I can go ahead and make a button. Now, this is not going to actually make a class which subclasses the button base class. What it's going to do instead is it's going to make a style, right? A custom style. And it's going to put it inside of a resource. So I'll call it my button. I'll just keep them here in the window. So what I see happened is I have a brand new button, which is taking on this style that I just got defined here as a new resource. And again, I could go back to that triggers editor and start to play around with all my triggers. So that's a little bit different of an operation than what we do when we make a brand new user control, where we really get a strongly typed class. This will just basically have a button with a custom style. So here in your slides, we're just kind of walking through the same example. This kind of is a perfect example of doing something really quickly that other toolkits would take a long time to do. How many times have you had to have a real button that just has some custom shape? I mean, my goodness, I remember doing similar things in MFC, and it was brutal. It was just absolutely brutal. I was writing code out of my ears. But here, I could just draw a circle in Blend and automatically convert it into a stylized button, right? And then after that point, as I mentioned, I could then edit my template and start to incorporate all my triggers. So I've already kind of done this demo already, so I'm not going to do that all over again. The final thing that I really want to talk about here, though, is just a really quick preview, and the operative sentence or the operative segment there is really quick. Just talk about what's coming down the road. Blend 3.0 adds in a couple of things that I think we're all going to love. The biggest thing is the evil yellow double clicking situation is gone. You just click once in your object in timeline area, and whatever you clicked is now the thing that will receive all the focus. So that's much, much simpler. Even more cool, we now have a built-in code editor. So let me just fire up Blend 3 here. And by the way, this is available through a CTP. So if you wanted to, you could download this technology preview today from the silverlight.net website is where I got mine. So by and large, we got the same excuse me, the same situation here. So I could make a brand new WPF project or a Silverlight 3 project. And I'll just go to make a new WPF project. And I'll just put him in my code. Call it Blend 3 Demo. I'm not going to really demo too much here, but I just want to show you a couple of really neat things. First of all, we now have IntelliSense in our XAML editor, right? Which is great. So if I wanted to change the border thickness, right? I wanted to change border thickness, right? I can now get some help here. If I come inside of my grid, maybe I'll just do that part manually, right? I'll start to get some real help. So I could make a button that has a height of 10 and a width of 100. Oops. And I could set the content to be okay, right? So as I'm doing this, of course, we'll just get the editor updated over here. Another great thing, too, is we now have a real code editor. So if I were to come back to my projects area, which they moved over here to the left-hand side, let's say I actually wanted to handle an event for that button. Well, first thing is, we're going to come to the event area. So I can come to my click for that button. Maybe we'll give them a better name, the test button. Here's my click on click me. So when I hit enter, what we now get is a real integrated code editor. So I could just do a message box dot show. Notice the IntelliSense here. Ta-da! So now when I run the program, I can actually work directly in Blend to author my code. Now, let's be honest here, this code editor is extremely helpful, but nowhere as feature-rich as Visual Studio. For example, this editor does not support any kind of code snippets. We're not going to get all the same features like a visual class designer. There's no debugger, right? This is just a way to just kind of quickly put in some code. You're going to want to go back to Visual Studio to make it all pretty. Okay, but this is great because it was always a pretty intrusive thing to have Visual Studio launch whenever you tried to handle an event. Now the downfall is if you get your graphical artist here, they might do things like this and have no clue what they're actually doing. So, like all things in life, there has to be a little bit of education that comes about with this new bit of power. Alright folks, well I have droned on and on long enough here. Thank you for checking out this video. Just a really quick wrap up for you. We've already kind of showcased what Blend can do, right? Remember that Blend is just a fancy markup tool. And even though it was really kind of created with the graphical artist in mind, programmers like us can get a lot of cool things done quickly. We talked about some of the real basic pieces. I was hoping that I pulled together the importance of working with these basic shapes. Shapes give us brushes and transformations, which give us resources. All of these things work together with animations to make custom templates and styles. We also took a quick tour at the beginning about making custom content. Then I just showed you a couple teeny things about Blend 3. So hopefully this has demystified the tool to some level for you. Remember, lots of information can be found in the F1 help system. So if this served you, that's great. Have a good day, everybody.